Franz Josef Land. Franz Josef Land of Francis Joseph's Land is an archipelago inhabited only by Russian military base personnel, located in the Arctic Ocean, Barents Sea and Kara Sea, constituting the northernmost part of Arkhangelsk Oblast in Russia. It consists of 191 islands, which cover an area of 16,134 square kilometers, stretching 375 kilometers from east to west and 234 kilometers from north to south. The islands are categorized in three groups: a western, central and eastern, separated by the British Channel and the Austrian Strait. The central group is further divided into a northern and southern section by the Markham Strait. The largest island is George Land, which measures 2,741 square kilometers, followed by Wilczek Land, Graham Bell Island and Alexandra Land. 85% of the archipelago is glaciated, with large unglaciated areas being located on the largest islands and many of the smallest islands. The islands have a combined coastline of 4,425 kilometers. Compared to other Arctic archipelagos, Franz Josef Land has a high dissection rate of 3.6 square kilometers per coastline kilometer. Cape Fledgley on Rudolph Island is the northernmost point of the Eastern Hemisphere. The highest elevations are found in the eastern group, with the highest point located on Wilczek Land, 670 meters above mean sea level. The archipelago was first spotted by the Norwegian sealers Niels Fredrik Ronbeck and Johan Petter Adijärvi in 1865, although they did not report the finding. The first reported finding was in the 1873 Austro-Hungarian North Pole expedition led by Julius von Payer and Karl Weyprecht, who named the area after Emperor Franz Joseph I. The islands were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1926, who settled small outposts for research and military purposes. The Kingdom of Norway rejected the claim and several private expeditions were sent to the islands. With the Cold War, the islands became off-limits for foreigners and two military airfields were built. The islands have been a nature sanctuary since 1994 and became part of the Russian Arctic National Park in 2012. History. There are two candidates for the discovery of Franz Josef Land. The first was the Norwegian sealing vessel Spitsbergen, with Captain Niels Fredrik Ronbeck and harpooner Johan Petter Adijärvi. They sailed northeast from Svalbard in 1865 searching for suitable sealing sites and found land which was most likely Franz Josef Land. The account is believed to be factual, but an announcement of the discovery was never made, and the sighting therefore remained unknown to subsequent explorers. It was at the time common to keep newly discovered areas secret, as the discovery was aimed at exploiting them for sealing and whaling, and exposure would cause competitors to flock to the site. Russian scientist N.G. Schilling proposed in 1865 that the ice conditions in the Barents Sea could only be explained if there was another land mass in the area, but he never received funding for an expedition. The Austro-Hungarian North Pole expedition of 1872–74 was the first to announce the discovery of the islands, led by Julius von Payer and Karl Weyprecht of Austria-Hungary on board the schooner The. The expedition's primary goal was to find the Northeast Passage and its secondary goal to reach the North Pole. Starting in July 1872, the vessel drifted from Novaya Zemlya to a new land mass, which they named in honor of Franz Joseph I, Emperor of Austria. The expedition contributed significantly to the mapping and exploration of the islands. The next expedition to spot the archipelago was the Dutch expedition for the exploration of the Barents Sea, on board the schooner Willem Barents. Constrained by the ice ice, they never reached land. Benjamin Lee Smith's expedition in 1880, aboard the bark Aira, followed a route from Spitsbergen to Franz Josef Land, landing on Bell Island in August. Lee Smith explored the vicinity and set up a base at Aira Harbor, before exploring towards McClintock Island. He returned the following year in the same vessel, landing at Grey Bay on George Land. The explorers were stopped by ice at Cape Flora, and Aira sank on the 21st of August. They built a cottage and stayed the winter, to be rescued by the British vessels Cara and Hope the following summer. These early expeditions concentrated their explorations on the southern and central parts of the archipelago. Nansen's Fram expedition was an 1893 to 1896 attempt by the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen to reach the geographical North Pole by harnessing the natural east-west current of the Arctic Ocean. Departing in 1893, Fram drifted from the New Siberian Islands for 1.5 years before Nansen became impatient and set out on a polar march with Hjalmar Johansen. They gave up on reaching the pole and instead returned to Franz Josef Land. They were thus able to establish that there was no large land mass north of the islands. In the meantime, the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition set off in 1894, set up a base on Bell Island, and stayed for the winter. The following season they spent exploring. By pure chance, at Cape Flora, Nansen stumbled upon Frederick George Jackson, who was able to transport him back to Norway. Nansen and Jackson explored the northern, eastern and western portions of the islands. Once the basic geography of Franz Josef Land had become apparent, expeditions shifted to using the archipelago as a basis to reach the North Pole. The first such attempt was conducted by the National Geographic Society-sponsored American journalist Walter Wellman in 1898. 2 Norwegians stayed the winter, but insufficient fuel caused one to die. Wellman returned the following year, but the polar expedition itself was quickly abandoned when they lost most of their equipment. Italian nobleman Luigi Amadeo organized the next expedition in 1899, on the Stella Polar. They stayed the winter, and in February and again in March 1900 set out towards the pole, but failed to get far. Evelyn Baldwin, sponsored by William Ziegler, organized the Ziegler Polar Expedition of 1901, setting up a base on Alger Island. He stayed the winter exploring the area, but failed to press northwards. The expedition was largely regarded as an utter failure by the exploration and scientific community, which cited the lack of proper management. Unhappy with the outcome, Ziegler organized a new expedition, for which he appointed Anthony Fiala, second in command in the first expedition, as leader. It arrived in 1903 and spent the winter. The ship, America, was crushed beyond repair in December and disappeared in January. Still, they made 2 attempts towards the pole, both of which were quickly abandoned. They were forced to stay another year, making yet another unsuccessful attempt at the pole, before being evacuated in 1905 by the Terra Nova. The first Russian expedition was carried out in 1901, when the icebreaker Yermak traveled to the islands. The next expedition, led by hydrologist Georgy Sedov, embarked in 1912 but did not reach the archipelago until the following year because of ice. Among its scientific contributions were the first snow measurements of the archipelago, and the determination that changes of the magnetic field occur in cycles of 15 years. It also conducted topographical surveys of the surrounding area. Scurvy set in during the second winter, killing a machinist. Despite lacking prior experience or sufficient provisions, Sedov insisted on pressing forward with a march to the pole. His condition deteriorated and he died on the 6th of March. Hertha was sent to explore the area, and its captain I. Liamov hoisted a Russian iron flag at Cape Flora and proclaimed Russian sovereignty over the archipelago. The act was motivated by the ongoing First World War and Russian fears of the Central Powers establishing themselves there. The world's first Arctic flight took place in August 1914, when Polish aviator Jan Nagorski overflew Franz Josef Land in search of Sedov's group. Andromeda set out for the same purpose while failing to locate them. A crew were able to finally determine the non-existence of Petermann Land and King Oscar Land, suspected lands north of the islands. Soviet expeditions were sent almost yearly from 1923. Franz Josef Land had been considered terra nullius, land belonging to no one, but on 15 April 1926 the Soviet Union declared its annexation of the archipelago, emulating Canada's declaration of the sector principle. They pronounced all land between the Soviet mainland and the North Pole to be Soviet territory. This principle has never been internationally recognized. Both Italy and Norway protested. Norway was first and foremost concerned about its economic interests in the area, in a period when Norwegian hunters and whalers were also being barred from the White Sea, Novaya Zemlya and Greenland. The Soviet government, however, largely remained passive, and did not evict Norwegian hunting ships during the following years. Nor did the Soviets interfere when, in 1926, several foreign ships entered the waters in search of the disappeared airship Italia. Norway attempted both a diplomatic solution and a Lars Christensen-financed expedition to establish a weather station to gain economic control over the islands, but both failed in 1929. Instead, the Soviet icebreaker Sedov set out, led by Otto Schmidt, landed in Tigay Bay, and began construction of a permanent base. The Soviet government proposed renaming the archipelago Fridtjof Nansen Land in 1930, but the name never came into use. In 1930 the Norwegian Brattvåg expedition visited the archipelago, but was asked by Soviet authorities to respect Soviet territorial water in the future. Other expeditions that year were the Norwegian-Swedish balloon expedition led by Hans Wilhelmsen Ullmann on Quest and the German Graf Zeppelin. Except for a German weather station in place during the Second World War, these were the last Western expeditions to Franz Josef Land until 1990. Soviet activities grew rapidly following the International Polar Year in 1932. The archipelago was circumnavigated, people were landed on Victoria Island, and a topographical map was completed. In 1934, 35 geological and glaciological expeditions were carried out, cartographic flights were flown, and up to 60 people stayed the winters between 1934 and 1936, which also saw the first berth. The first drifting ice station was set up out of Rudolph Island in 1936. An airstrip was then constructed on a glacier on the island, and by 1937 the winter population hit 300. Activity dwindled during the Second World War and only a small group of men were kept at Rudolph Island, remaining unsupplied throughout the war. They never discovered that a German weather station, named Schatzgruber, had been established on Alexandra Land. However, it was evacuated in 1944 after the men were struck by trichinosis. The Cold War produced renewed Soviet interest in the islands because of the strategic military significance. The islands were regarded as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The site of the former German weather station was selected as the location of a Soviet aerodrome and military base, Nagorskoye. With the advent of intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Soviet Union changed its military strategy in 1956, abolishing the strategic strategic need for an airbase on the archipelago. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958 gave a new rise to the scientific interest in the archipelago, and an airstrip was built on Räisänen Island in 1956. The following year, the geophysical Arkhangelsk Observatory was established there. Activity at Tyr Bay was closed in 1959. Because of the island's military significance, the Soviet Union closed off the area to foreign researchers, although Soviet researchers carried out various expeditions, including in geophysics, studies of the ionosphere, marine biology, botany, ornithology and glaciology. The Soviet Union opened up the archipelago for international activities from 1990, with foreigners having fairly straightforward access. The base on Graham Bell Island was abandoned in the early 1990s. The military presence at Nagorskoye was reduced to that of a border post, and the number of people stationed at Arkhangelsk Observatory were reduced from 70 to a dozen. The archipelago and the surrounding waters was declared a nature reserve in April 1994. The opening of the archipelago also saw the introduction of tourism, most of which takes place on Russian-operated icebreakers. In 2011, in a move to better accommodate tourism in the archipelago, the Russian Arctic National Park was expanded to include Franz Josef Land. In 2012, the Russian Air Force decided to reopen Graham Bell Airfield as part of a series of reopenings of airbases in the Arctic. Geography. The archipelago constituted the northernmost part of Russia's Arkhangelsk Oblast, located between 79 degrees 46 and 81 degrees 52 north and 44 degrees 52 and 62 degrees 25 east. It is situated 360 kilometers north of Novaya Zemlya and 260 kilometers east of the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, located within the Arctic Ocean. Franz Josef Land constitutes the northeastern border of the Barents Sea and the northwestern border of the Kara Sea. The islands are 900 kilometers from the North Pole and 750 kilometers from the Yamal Peninsula, the closest point of the Eurasian mainland. The archipelago falls within varying definitions of the Asia-Europe border, and is therefore variously defined as part of Asia-Europe. Cape Flyleigh, situated at 81 degrees 50 north, is the northernmost point in Eurasia and the Eastern Hemisphere, and of either Europe or Asia, depending on the continental definition. It is the third closest land mass to the North Pole. The archipelago counts 191 uninhabited islands with a combined area of 16,134 square kilometers. These stretch 375 kilometers from east to west and 234 kilometers from north to south. The islands are categorized in three groups: a western, central and eastern, separated by the British Channel and the Austrian Strait. The central group is further divided into a northern and southern section by the Markham Strait. Graham Bell Island is separated from the eastern group by the Severo-Vostochny Strait. There are two named island clusters: Räisänen Land north of the Markham Sound and Räisänen to the extreme northeast. The straits are narrow, between several hundred meters to 3 kilometers wide. They reach depths of 500 to 600 meters, 150 to 300 meters below the shelf of the Barents Sea. The largest island is George Land, which measures 2,741 square kilometers. Three additional islands exceed 1,000 square kilometers in size: Wiltshire Land, Graham Bell Island and Alexandra Land. 5 more islands exceed 500 square kilometers: Hall Island, Salisbury Island, McClintock Island, Jackson Island and Hooker Island. The smallest 135 islands constitute 0.4% of the archipelago's area. The highest elevation is a peak on Wilczek Land, which rises 670 meters above mean sea level. Victoria Island, located 170 kilometers to the west of Alexandra Land, is administratively part of the archipelago, but the island is not geographically part of the island group and is closer to Svalbard, located 60 kilometers from Kvitoria. Geologically, the archipelago is located on the northern edge of the Barents Sea platform, within an area where Mesozoic sedimentary rocks are exposed. The area has 4 units separated by regional erosion surfaces. The Upper Paleozoic unit is poorly exposed and was created by folding during the Caledonian period. The Lower Mesozoic unit, consisting of coastal and marine sediments from the Upper Triassic period, are present on most island and on the bottom of straits, and consist of limestones, shales, sandstones and conglomerate. The Upper Mesozoic unit dominates in the southern and western parts, consisting of massive effusive rocks made up of basaltic sheets separated by volcanic ashes and tuffs, mixed with terrigenous rocks with layers of coal. The Mesozoic Tertiary unit remains mostly on the sea floor and consists of marine quartz sandstones and shales. Plate tectonics of the Arctic Ocean created basalt lavas and dolerite sheets and dikes in the Upper Jurassic and Lower Cretaceous periods. The land is rising by 2.5 to 3.0 millimeters per year due to the melting of the Barents Sea ice sheet. California. 10,000 years ago. Hydrology. Franz Josef Land is dominated by glaciation, which covers an area of 13,735 square kilometers, or 85% of the archipelago. The glaciers have an average thickness of 180 meters, which would convert to 2,500 cubic kilometers. This would alone give a 6 mm eustatic rise in sea level should it melt. Large ice-free areas are only found on the largest islands, such as the 499.8 square kilometer Armitage Peninsula of George Land, the 493.7 square kilometer Comiskey Peninsula of Graham Bell Island, the 270 square kilometer Central Nasusha of Alexandra Land, the 162.6 square kilometer Ganza Point of Wilczek Land, and the 84.2 square kilometer Hayes Island. Most of the smaller islands are unglaciated. Streams only form during the runoff period from May through early September. Permafrost causes most of the runoff to take place on the surface, with streams only forming on the largest islands. The longest river is 19 kilometers long and forms on George Land, while there are several streams on Alexandra Land, the longest being 8.4 kilometers. There are about 1,000 lakes in the archipelago, the majority of which are located on Alexandra Land and George Land. Most lakes are located in depressions caused by glacial erosion, in addition to a smaller number of lagoon lakes. The sizes vary from 2 square kilometers to 0.4 hectares. Most are only 2 meters deep, with the deepest measured at 10 meters. The sea currents surrounding the archipelago touch eastern Svalbard and northern Novaya Zemlya. The cold Makarov current flows from the north and the Arctic current flows from the northwest, while the warmer Novaya Zemlya current flows from the south. The latter has temperatures over 0.5 degrees Celsius, while the bottom water lies below -1.7 degrees Celsius. The southern coastal regions of the archipelago experience currents from east to west. Average velocity is between 2 and 5 centimeters per second. The tidal component in coastal areas is 15 centimeters per second. Pack ice occurs throughout the year around the entire island group, with the lowest levels being during August and September. One year winter ice starts forming in October and reaches a thickness of 1.5 meters. Icebergs are common year-round. Climate. The main forces influencing the climate are the glaciation and sea ice. At 81 degrees north, the archipelago experiences 141 annual days of midnight sun, from the 12th of April to the 30th of August. During the winter, it experiences 128 days of polar night, from the 19th of October to the 23rd of February. Even during summer, the angle of the sun rays spreads the limited radiated energy over a large area. Further cooling is caused by the high amount of cloudiness. The sea starts to freeze in late September and reaches its annual maximum in March, at which time 95% of the sea is ice-covered. The ice starts to decrease in May and suffers a major melting in June, with the minimum occurring in August or early September. During winter, high-pressure weather and clear skies cause radiation loss from the ground, sending temperatures down to -40 degrees Celsius. Low-pressure weather gives strong winds and precipitation, with temperature spells creeping up to and above the freezing point. During shifts, the temperatures can change by 20 degrees Celsius within hours. Coastal stations experience mean January temperatures of between -20 degrees Celsius and -30 degrees Celsius, varying heavily from year to year depending on the degree of cycles in weather patterns. During summer, the temperatures are a lot more even and average at between 0 degrees Celsius and 3 degrees Celsius at Hayes Island. Fog is most common during the summer. Average annual precipitation at the coastal stations is between 100 and 150 millimeters, with the wettest months being from July through September. Elevated areas can experience considerably higher precipitation. Franz Josef Land is significantly colder than Spitsbergen, which experiences 8 degrees Celsius warmer winter averages, but is warmer than the Canadian Arctic archipelago.